Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is second bite at the cherry in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 41. Ninth Tenet of the Shinobi Neutrality Pact. A village is considered bound to the pact until the village changes leadership. A new leader must sign the pact upon promotion, or else the village will be removed from pact agreements. Even in the desert, nighttime had always been aflutter with life. Gaara knew this better than anyone. With the shade of night to protect them, wildlife became aflutter in the dark. Birds took to the skies, insects scuttled along the village walls, and sand cats were always on the prowl, looking for stray rabbits and ground squirrels. A foreigner might think the desert quiet. Gaara knew better. The caves of Takigaku, however, were truly silent at night. Gaara wasn't certain if it was village ritual, or just the fact that they were far beneath ground, but the only sound that made it to his ears was the far-off rush of the underground river that flowed into the village's lake. Even then, the lake seemed still. The bats flew on silent wings after glowing dragonflies, and even then Gaara couldn't hear them pushing through the night air. No noise, not a sound from the world buried within the caves. And perhaps it was the silence that made Sakura's dreaming whimpers even more painful to listen to. It had been 4 nights since Sakura had faced down Itaki Uchiha at the border of the mountain's graveyard. 4 days of Sakura exhausted from chakra drainage and an unknown toll on her mind that the healers could only shrug through. Sakura put on a cheerful face, but Gaara was learning now how to read beneath the masks people wore. Sakura wasn't exhausted, no, that was too generous a term for whatever it was Itaki's technique did to a person. Sakura was empty, and when the night came, so did the nightmares. For once, Gaara was grateful that he did not sleep. She whimpered less when he kept a hand on her shoulder. It gets better, Kakashi had told him. Gaara had been somewhat relieved when Kakashi had told him that he, too, had survived the technique, and Kakashi didn't whimper in his sleep. But the technique of the Mangekyo warps one's perception of time. 3 days can happen in the span of a single moment. It takes a while before the brain catches up to reality. Kakashi hadn't mentioned how long, and Gaara knew better than to ask. If this was what it was like for Sakura, equally so it must have been for Kakashi. All he could do was trust that Sakura would heal and, for now, be there. The healers estimated another week before Sakura's chakra recovered enough for her to be in traveling condition. And they were in one of the safest villages on the continent. Gaara couldn't complain too much. Here, in the Taki Caves, they could afford to rest. Emi bristled suddenly in his lap, her tiny claws raking into the fabric of his pants. Whenever Sai approached, it usually unnerved her. At first, Gaara had wondered if it was the nature of how Sai approached, quiet and unusually quick. However, Emi tended to get antsy even when she saw Sai coming a block away. His demeanor, then, Gaara theorized. He knew that, when he was young, his calm, murderous nature had unnerved most people. Sai didn't exude any sort of nature at all, and perhaps that was even more upsetting to an animal that could only gauge a situation by reading body language and intent. Sai appeared in the window just as Gaara began to soothe Emi with a back rub. He tended to come to Sakura's room every night, quietly watching for a while before returning to his own room. Something was on the boy's mind, and Gaara had pried time and time again to no avail. Sakura had milked some truths out of him, but he was no Sakura. All he could do was wait and hope that Sai would either figure it out, or figure out how to talk to others. For about an hour, the two of them sat in silence. Emi took her time before settling back down into Gaara's lap, but kept her eye on Sai at all times. There was a strange tenseness in the air, and Gaara realized for the first time that this was probably how it felt for others to see him at night. She shouldn't have gone. Gaara blinked as Sai finally spoke. He was amazed that the boy's voice didn't wake Sakura, but despite her twitching she remained steadily asleep. Gaara hated admitting that he agreed with Sai. She doesn't regret it, he countered. Not this time. But if she continues to act stupidly, there will come such a time. Tell that to her, then. I don't think she'd listen to me, Sai argued. His face held no emotion as he looked upon Sakura's sleeping form. But she'd listen to you. You're her partner. Gaara wasn't sure that Sakura would listen to anyone when she set her mind to something. But Sai had a point. If Sakura was going to listen to anyone at all. But who was he to lecture her on doing something he might have easily tried himself? Risking life and limb for another, Gaara wouldn't have done it for just anyone, but he would do it for Sakura, no matter who was on the other side of the fight. That Sakura would do it for a stranger was, if one looked at it critically, a stupid action. But Gaara was beginning to understand that sort of action now. To do things for others, to live for others, to die for others. Gaara had seen people at their strongest protecting others. Who was he to dissuade Sakura from doing what he had seen her do time and time again? First for Sasuke, now for Fu, it was, Gaara had realized, just who Sakura was. No, Gaara shook his head. I don't think she'd listen to me either. Then maybe you will listen to me. Gaara looked to Sai, unsure of what the boy meant. I'm listening to you now. I mean really listen. You want this peace treaty to succeed, don't you? Yes. Then you should see the problem. People like you and I, we shouldn't be around her. Sakura acts stupidly when it comes to others. She tries to protect them at the expense of her own well-being. She can't possibly juggle vying for peace and keeping you safe from Akatsuki at the same time. If you stay with her, you'll just be putting her and the treaty in danger. Emi growled at this, her fur bristling again. It took a few determined pats before Gaara could calm her. He was convinced, at times, that the Tanuki somehow perfectly understood spoken word, but in this case, the intent Sai was giving off now was a confusing one. Gaara wasn't sure if Sai was acting hostile or something else. And of course Sai had a point. It was much harder to be angry with him when he was logically sound. So what are you going to do about it? Gaara decided to try a different approach. There was no winning an argument with Sai, only getting to the heart of the matter. I was under the impression that you cannot return to Konoha. No, Sai agreed. I cannot. And I will not return to Suna. There is no life for me there. None who see me as more than a weapon. IWA would take you in. Taki, too, with how much they value the Baijuya. You are more than capable of finding a place in the world away from Sakura. The same could be said of you. A skilled shinobi would be welcomed in almost any village. Sai shook his head. Root will find me no matter where I go. It is only a matter of time. There was an awkward silence then. An impasse. Nothing Gaara could say would sway him, and Sai sure as hell wasn't going to convince him to leave Sakura's side. Even if it was dangerous, even if it meant difficulties, even if that meant he was selfish, Gaara couldn't leave her now. Naruto had once referred to her as a precious person, someone he would do anything to protect. How ironic, now, how Gaara had come to fill that very same role. There was a quiet flutter of movement and Sai was gone. But in his place on the windowsill, Gaara saw a familiar book. Sai's sketchbook. The boy carried it with him everywhere, so why would he leave it now? Curiously, Gaara reached out, his sand wrapping around the book and bringing it towards him. As he opened it to look, Emi popped her head through his arms, her eyes glancing over it as well. Drawings. Pages and pages of drawings. Many of them were simple drawings. Birds. Mice. Deer. Trees. All things they had likely run across in their time at IWA and during the journey to Taki. Gaara even caught sight of a few drawings of bats and dragonflies. But those weren't the pictures that interested him. It was instead the pictures of Sakura and himself that caught his eyes. Dozens upon dozens of portraits, all trying to capture the same expression. Sakura, smiling. Him, not quite smiling yet, but Gaara could see a sort of peace in his eyes that had been much more common on his face as of late. His first thought was that it was a bit strange that Sai had been drawing them so much, but he realized all at once that it wasn't them in particular he was trying to capture, it was the expression. The feeling. Happiness. Joy. Peace. And then, Gaara turned to the final page, and his heart froze in his chest. A single word. Farewell. He's going to do something stupid. Shikaku's voice echoed in his mind, and Gaara found himself agreeing with the Baijuya. Sakura must be rubbing off on him. But what? If there was nowhere Sai could go that Root wouldn't find him, wasn't the best option to stay here with them where it was safe? Why leave? And where would he go to? And perhaps it didn't matter, because Gaara knew Sakura well enough to know that she would pissed if he allowed Sai to do something stupid on his watch. And damn it all, Sakura had been through enough. He'd wasted time going through the book, and Sai was hard to track. Gaara pocketed the book, not wanting Sakura to find it if she woke. He plopped Emi onto the ground and made his way to the open window. Emi, surprisingly, followed him. Can you sniff him out? Gaara asked. Emi let out a small bark in response. She hobbled her way to the windowsill, her nose scrunching as she sniffed the air. Then, without more prodding needed, she scampered off into the night. Well, it was as good a lead as any. Gaara followed, which was surprisingly difficult. Tanuki were fast, and they could scamper through holes and alleys that were difficult for someone of Gaara's size to get through. But the Tanuki had caught on to something, and Gaara had reached the point where he was willing to trust the animal's instincts. He could only hope he had enough time. The shinobi of Taki were only too happy to see him leave. Sakura, they trusted tentatively, but everyone else in her group were foreigners, and most Taki shinobi grouped foreigners in a series of two adjectives, untrustworthy and dangerous. When Sai told them that he was returning to Konoha, they let him through without a second thought. Sai couldn't even begin to let himself think how stupid a move it was to let any of them leave at all. They knew where the entrance to the caves were, they could bring an army. But that didn't matter now. None of it mattered. He couldn't allow himself to think about Taki's defensive practices, because in about an hour or so, it wouldn't matter to him at all. The night was still, and the only sounds were that of his feet hitting the branches of the trees as he ran. Sai was purposeful in his breaking of silence. His plan wouldn't work if the people he was looking for didn't hear him. Sai had learned two things in his time with Sakura Haruno. The first was that, despite the fervent claims of Danzo and the senior members of Root, it was impossible to completely stamp out emotion from a human heart. Sai had seen over a year ago what the shinobi Gaara had been like, before the invasion of Konoha had begun. The boy had been more monster than man, ruthless, what Danzo might have even considered a perfect killing machine. It was hard to reconcile the image of the homicidal Jinhiriki with the boy that Sai had spoken with now. There wasn't a trace of the killer left. So maybe it shouldn't have surprised him when he'd start to feel emotions bubble up through the shell of apathy that he had spent years honing to perfection. Outside of the regiment of Root, outside of Danzo's thumb, he had reverted. He had begun to feel again. He had begun to want things. He had begun to dislike things. And there was one factor that linked him and Gaara, one factor that had absolutely been a catalyst for these emotional changes. Sakura. Which led him to the second thing he had learned: Sakura was going to change things. It wasn't necessarily her that had been needed. She had simply been the one to step into a role that had been empty for decades. Not since the first Hokage had anyone ever tried to unite the shinobi world. Instead, there had been war. Deception. Invasion after invasion, skirmish after skirmish. It had become expected. But Sakura had taken the step to upturn the status quo. Even with the mere act of pushing for peace, she was reminding others that it was an option. If she failed, someone else would take her place. Sakura wasn't just starting a treaty, she was potentially starting a movement. Unless, of course, someone nipped that movement in the bud. Sai knew as well as any member of Root that Danzo Shimura would not allow a peace treaty to come into effect. Konoha, as far as Danzo preached, was meant to be a dominant, ruling force. A treaty would never ensure that future for the village. Sakura was a threat, one that Danzo would stop at nothing to eliminate. But Sakura now had the backing of more than just the current Hokage. With the Tsuchikage and the Tokikage backing her, Danzo couldn't afford to make a direct movement against her. He had to play things smart. He had to outmaneuver her. And Danzo had been playing this game for a very long time. What was absolutely certain right now was that there was no way that Sai would be able to avoid the repercussions of leaving Root. At the very least, Danzo would ensure his death. That outcome, at this point, was near unavoidable. It was possible that he could prolong the inevitable by staying with Sakura, but it was just a prolonging. And if he stayed, that led to the worst option. Danzo would use him against Sakura. It wouldn't be outright. Sakura had written enough into the neutrality pact to cover Sai's defection. Any person, civilian, or shinobi, could choose to become an ambassador, and even if it was by proxy, Tsunade had signed the pact, which meant that any citizen of Konoha was covered by it. Sai included. But that wouldn't stop Danzo from using him against Sakura. He was a master of pulling strings, saying the right words behind the scenes. Sure, he would say, Sakura preached peace, but who was to say she wasn't trying to amass a shinobi army to start a village of her own? She'd pulled one of his own loyal agents away, brainwashed him even into believing that the good of the country took priority over the good of his own kin. If Sai stayed with Sakura, he would simply be a weapon against her. Sai had known this for some time, toyed with the scenarios in his mind as they'd traveled from Iwa to Taki. But it hadn't been until Sakura had faced down Itachi Uchiha that he'd realized the only course of action that was left for him to take. Sakura had been willing to risk her life for a near stranger. It had been stupid, but it had been the right thing to do. Saving Fyu from Akatsuki ingratiated her to Taki, and prevented Akatsuki from gaining a valuable resource. If she had died defending Fyu, she would have died for the right causes, the sake of peace, and the safety of the Jinhiriki. Sakura hadn't thought twice about it. She'd simply done it. Sai had come to admire the decision. Rude had taught him to act without hesitation for the good of the village. That sort of action was second nature. And it was time for him to apply his training for one final mission. He wouldn't allow himself to be a weapon. Not against Sakura. She had fought for him. She had offered her life for him back in Iwagakure. Sai's thoughts lingered on his brother, and he smiled. Yes, the feeling was not unlike what he had felt for his brother back then. This warmth. He couldn't let this warmth die out. He couldn't allow Sakura to fail now because of him. He would ensure that her path forward was just a little bit clearer, even if it was only a little bit. Danzo would be her enemy, but he would have to work harder to get an edge once Sai's final mission was done. It didn't take long for a root agent to find him. Now that he was far from the Taki caves, closer to the Konoha border, it was only natural that there would be an agent or two skulking around looking for him. Root were masters of infiltration. There were root agents stationed in every country. Taki was no exception. Sai came to a halt in a meadow. The grass had grown to knee height, and with spring in full motion, pink flowers had begun to bloom on the ground around him. It was kind of pretty. A good place for an end. The root agent landed in front of him, sword drawn. Their face was covered in a mask, with no discerning sign that they were working for Konoha. If a Taki shinobi saw them, Konoha would not be held accountable. As far as it appeared, this was simply two rogue shinobi, settling something. Agent. The voice sounded masculine. Sai recognized it. An agent only 3 years his senior, one who had trained him in Kenjutsu when he was a child. Rude has ordered your immediate execution and retrieval. Sai couldn't help but let out a small breath of relief. Danzo hadn't yet considered the benefits of keeping Sai alive and with Sakura. He was still motivated to protect his reputation. Retrieve his assets. He'd moved quickly enough. I am aware. Sai answered. I have become compromised. I offer my life freely for the good of Konoha. The agent hesitated. Sai couldn't help but wonder if he, too, felt emotions beneath that mask. They were made to kill their brothers in order to graduate Root's grueling training. Contrary to Danzo's belief, that didn't make it easier when it came to situations like this. Even before Sakura, Sai would have hesitated too. Do you have any final words? Sai took a deep breath. Even with recent events, he felt strangely calm now. At peace. This was the right decision, the right thing to do, for her. For everyone. Final words? What more could he say, here and now? Maybe, it would have been nice to have a final word with Sakura. But she would have stopped him then. Wouldn't have understood. No. There was nothing left to say. I have none. The agent readied his sword, and Sai closed his eyes. He heard a clash of steel. Sai opened his eyes again and saw sand swirling around him. The agent in front of him had been blocked by a hovering wall of it, and he struggled to push through only for a moment before retreating back several hops away. There was a rush of wind, and then Sai felt chakra. It was so thick that he almost heaved with the intensity of it. He'd never felt energy this thick before, never felt something dripping with this much anger. If he'd blinked, he would have missed Gaara flying by him. He wouldn't have seen the sand swirl into place around the Jinhiraki's arm, forming the shape of a heavy claw. He wouldn't have seen the look of pure fury on Gaara's face. Wouldn't have felt the rage. There was a sickening crunch, and the root agent dropped to the ground, still. For a brief moment, the forest was quiet. Sai held his breath, feeling fear for the first time he could remember. The fear only intensified as Gaara spun towards him and their eyes met. Though the sand claw had started to drop to the ground, Sai could still feel the angry aura dripping from the Jinhiraki, and he was frozen in place as Gaara approached. They looked each other in the eyes, and Gaara took a few heaving breaths. Then, Gaara lashed out and punched him. It was a clean hit. Sai saw a flash, and he dropped to the ground before he could process just what exactly had happened. He reached up, gingerly touching at the side of his face. Definitely going to bruise. He felt something grab his shirt, and when he looked up he saw Gaara again. "What were you thinking?" There was a slight distortion to Gaara's voice still, and Sai couldn't help but tremble. Maybe he'd made a mistake, thinking Gaara wasn't still volatile, especially with what he'd just done. And then, all at once, the aura began to fade. Sai could breathe again, and Gaara's expression changed from anger to something more similar to distress. "What were you thinking?" he repeated. "That man was about to kill you." "I know." Sai gasped. "That was supposed to be the intention. But why?" "It's the only way. The only way Sakura will be safe from Root. I have to remove myself from the equation." Gaara let go of his shirt, and Sai hit the ground once again. His head was still swimming from the blow, and, well, there was a part of him that was convinced he was dreaming this. Gaara, come to save him? He hadn't been convinced Gaara particularly liked him. Why? Sai forced himself to ask. It would be easier. One less problem to solve. And you'd have Sakura all to yourself again. Because it's not what she wants. Gaara practically yelled in response. She's still recovering from that bastard's attack. Do you really think seeing you dead would relieve her? Sai didn't have an answer to that. It was silly, that she'd gotten so attached to him. Silly that she got attached to others so easily. It was going to get her killed one day. He felt a hand grab his arm, and suddenly he was heaved upward into a standing position. "You're coming back," Gaara told him. "And if you try anything stupid again, I'll take Shukaku's advice and knock you unconscious. It might be easier to do that anyway. I'm not sure which way is up." "Oh." Sai felt his arm get pulled around Gaara's shoulders, until the boy was holding him up. From there, the two of them began to walk. Gaara was fairly steady, and it didn't take long before Sai's head stopped spinning and he could start holding himself up again. "You realize Root is going to hear about this. There are a lot of demons in the woods," Gaara retorted. "He got unlucky. Root is going to do everything within their power to bring you and Sakura down. We know. I'm just going to dash." "Stop." Gaara came to a halt. He shifted so he could look at Sai directly. "Listen to me. All right. I used to hate you." The admission was blunt, but not surprising. Any idiot could have figured out the Jinhiraki hadn't been fond of him since day one. "You were annoying. You got between me and Sakura. And you're a liability. But, you're one of us." And, Gaara let out a small sigh. "And I can't let you make Sakura upset. She cares about you. Which means I have to care about you. And if you keep trying to throw your life away, I'll just keep dragging you back until you get it through your head that we aren't going to let you die for us." Gaara then reached out, jabbing a finger at his chest. "And don't you dare tell me that I'm being stupid." There was a lot Sai could have said. He'd thought Gaara would understand. To give one's life for another, wasn't that the point? Wasn't that why Sakura was where she was now? She'd said it herself, she'd left her village to find a way to keep her old teammates safe. For the good of others, that was what had started all of this. Sai turned and began to walk again. "No, there was nothing more to say. His final mission had failed. All that was left now was to Sai, what do you want? Sai stopped. The question, what did it mean? What did it matter? It has never mattered what I've wanted. I existed solely for the good of Konoha. And now, I exist to dash. That's not what I asked, Sai. Gaara was determined, it seemed, to get some sort of answer. Sai debated lying, coming up with something to satisfy him. What he wanted. I want to feel it. Sai answered. That feeling of peace that you feel with each other. Being sure in each other. Having a purpose that you chose. His thoughts went to his brother. The only other person he'd let himself care for. He'd forgotten what that meant, to really feel for another person. If Sakura dies because of me, that won't be what I feel. Then we make sure she doesn't die. Gaara held out a hand to him, still just as determined as before. We swear it, here and now. No more running. We do this her way, and we keep her safe. Whether it's Root or Akatsuki or anything. We don't let anything touch Sakura again. Sai looked at the hand, and then back to Gaara. It was more desirable than dying. Even if dying was easier. But it didn't seem like it was his time just yet. And Gaara, despite everything, had come for him. Had saved his life. It would be a bit of a dick move to turn his back on Gaara now. Sai took his hand. We swear it. He agreed. Nothing touches Sakura again. Gaara nodded in approval, and they shook. They began to walk again, and Sai did his best to ignore the throbbing from the bruise that was likely forming on his face. And you promise never to punch me that hard again. I don't make promises I can't keep. Grumpy. Asshole. Sai stole a glance at Gaara. There was a small smile on the boy's face now, and... well, Sai couldn't help but smile a little bit too. Chapter 42. Sakura woke up alone. This was somewhat unusual. Gaara hadn't left her side since she'd awoken from her chakra-exhausted state, and though Sakura couldn't help but wonder where the boy had gotten to, she was a little bit grateful for the, no doubt, temporary alone time. She had to put on a brave face when Gaara was around or else he'd worry. Now, she could let herself be. Well, she wasn't exactly upset. Another nightmare, but at this point it was becoming the norm, waking up in a cold sweat with the afterimage of dead loved ones burned into her eyes. At some point, Sakura's mind had just become numb. If she'd experienced the full effects of the Mangekyo, the full 3 days Ataki had promised, would this have happened still? Or would each death have felt as fresh as the first? Sakura hoped she never had to find the answer to that, but she did know that dealing with the after effects of Ataka's eyes was not great and not something she'd quite figured out how best to approach yet. Some part of her wanted to cry, and another part of her hated herself for it. She had always been the crybaby, unable to move or act while Sasuke or Naruto handled a tough situation for her. She was sick of crying. Kakashi hadn't cried when he'd woken up. Sasuke hadn't. Well, perhaps that was an unfair comparison. Sasuke had woken up different after his time with Ataki. Whatever Ataki had shown him, it had been enough to drive him to Orochimaru. And Kakashi never showed much emotion in front of anyone. Sakura desperately wanted to ask him how he'd coped, what he'd seen, how he'd felt, but then she remembered that it was Kakashi and pulling out an honest response about himself was harder than pulling teeth. So maybe, in this particular case, it was okay to cry just a little bit. With Gaara gone, it was easier to let it come. So Sakura finally let herself feel. Itaki had been so damn strong that he'd captured her in Genjutsu without her even meeting his eyes or realizing he'd done it, from hundreds of feet away. Itaki had caught her in a technique so powerful that Sakura still wasn't sure how she'd pulled free. Kakashi doubted her, but if Kakashi couldn't break it, if Sasuke couldn't break it, then clearly some sort of deity had to have helped her, because there was no way she had some sort of latent ability that enabled her to resist Sharingan. Her mind began to work through it again as she cried, and it was easier now that she didn't have to worry about keeping her emotions in check. Her amulet had burned, and all of the chakra in her body had momentarily disappeared. Had it vanished, or had she somehow thrust it out of her all at once? The healers had theorized that she'd burned out her chakra coils attempting to do a strong earth jutsu without waiting for her chakra fully return, which suggested the former, but how did one's chakra simply vanish? It wasn't that she'd severed the connection temporarily, it had just been gone. And there was a detail that she'd missed, something that her mind kept nagging her to remember, but the memory was fuzzy now and Sakura couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen something important and just forgotten. Frustration began to override her sorrow, and the tears stopped. Anger, Sakura was learning, had a way of keeping other emotions at bay. It was little wonder Sasuke had developed the way he had been. It was easier to be angry at his brother. Harder to grieve. Harder to cope. How funny that Sakura understood him now far better than she ever had before, when it was too late. Her body still tingled at times, but her chakra had almost fully returned to a normal state. But what gave Sakura pause was that it somehow felt different. Like a foreign body had invaded her coils instead of her own chakra. She'd been forbidden from trying jutsu until the healers gave her permission, and with Gaara watching her so closely she'd been hesitant to disobey, but now with him gone. A tiny little jutsu couldn't hurt now, could it? Just to see? Maybe she'd feel better if she let her chakra just flow for a bit, do something that was too easy to be exhausting. Her sensing jutsu. Sakura took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She had to do it now, before Gaara returned to chastise her. She ran through the hand signals and pushed her chakra outwards. Everything flooded in at once, and Sakura let out a small yelp. It was like she'd somehow blinded herself with the action, but as she processed what had occurred, she realized that somehow there was just chakra everywhere. In the ground, in the walls, in the fungus growing on the cave walls outside, in the lake, in the giant tree that dominated over the village, as well as every person around her, not just shinobi. Shinobi had more than civilians, far more, but everyone had so much chakra that her mind couldn't process it all at once, so instead she just registered signal. Slowly the signal began to fade, and after what felt like an eternity it became easier to process. Sakura felt a heavy tingling throughout her body as chakra bled in to replace what she'd spent. Too much, she finally realized, she had somehow put out too much chakra. And that was more frustrating than she'd liked to admit. She was a master at chakra control, she'd been told so by plenty of people, so how had she suddenly started overusing? A different test, she decided. She went through a couple of hand signals to create a basic clone. It popped into existence perfectly on her bed, looking just like her, and no tingling, no overuse of chakra. Nothing. Sakura frowned. She went through the signs of her sensing jutsu again, and then once again a wave of impossibly heavy signal reached her. She winced, pain coursing through her head as she tried to process. So it wasn't her chakra control that had been affected, but her sensing jutsu? Sakura cursed out loud. As if she didn't have enough mysteries on her hands at the moment, now her sensing jutsu wasn't working right, and the only clue she had was that it had something to do with what happened with Itachi. But there were workarounds for this. Too much chakra? Then maybe if she just... Sakura went through the hand signs again, but this time she held her chakra back. Only a trickle this time, maybe a fifth of what was required. The world seemed to light up around her, but instead of a blinding signal, it was tempered. More like she was used to. She sensed a presence afloor beneath her, several in the buildings around her, and as she concentrated she could make out signals further out into the village. A couple 100 feet out, perhaps. It would take time to get used to, but essentially whatever had happened had just made it so she needed less chakra to use the sensing jutsu. It was completely illogical. Her other jutsu had required the same amount. What kind of side effect altered her experience with one jutsu and nothing else? But maybe it was a blessing. Less chakra needed meant more times she could use it. And if she had time to experiment a little, she could figure out the precise amount of chakra she could use on the jutsu before it blinded her. Maybe she could sense further. She could definitely sense more. Never before had she been able to sense chakra in civilians or trees or water. She wasn't even sure water was supposed to have chakra. She certainly hadn't read about it, the academy hadn't taught it, and yet. Sakura took a deep breath and allowed herself to lay back down on her pillow. She didn't have enough information, and letting herself dwell on mysteries was a good distraction from her nightmares, but poor for her mind overall. She could instead let herself be excited. Today was the day she'd get a final checkup from the healers, and if all was well they'd begin the journey to Konoha. She was going home. And home had Danzo en route and the Chiryunin exams and convincing Morkage to join the pact and. Alright, so thinking of the general concept of home wasn't the best idea either. She needed something more specific. Something happy that no anxious thought or worry could intrude upon. And then Sakura realized, all at once, that today was her birthday. She shot up from her bed with a start. It was frightening how easily she'd forgotten such an important event. She was 14 years old today. She'd survived another year, and not only that, she'd become an ambassador. She didn't know many 14-year-olds from Konoha that had her traveling experience or her current privileges. Sure, Naruto was training under the Hokage and Sasuke had Orochimaru, but she'd had the Tsuchikage in what she was starting to call the traveling school of hard knocks. She'd helped out in a shinobi rebellion. She'd taken down demons. Faced down fucking Itachi Uchiha and lived to tell about it. She was 14 years old today and she had done most these things in the past year. That was something to smile about. Maybe some of those things had been difficult, but looking at all of the good things she'd accomplished, how could she complain? And not only had she started the Neutrality Project, but she had companions now, companions who believed in her. As if on cue, both Gaara and Sai hopped in through her window, Emi scuttling along in behind them. And, Sai had a massive black eye. Sai. Sakura pushed herself out of bed, wobbly but able to stand. What the hell happened? Did you get attacked by someone here? It was clear the boys hadn't expected her to be awake. She saw both visibly startled, looking her way and then. Gaara looked sheepish, and even Sai was beginning to have some sort of expression on his face, which was saying something. Gaara and I had a disagreement. Sai spoke up. We worked it out. Are you telling me Gaara punched you in the eye? I said we worked it out. I was clearly in the wrong. Sakura shot Gaara a look, and Gaara couldn't meet her eyes. Well, they'd worked it out if they weren't still fighting now, but Sakura couldn't just excuse these two fighting over. What even were you disagreeing on? There was a moment of silence. Gaara looked over to Sai, Sai looked over to Gaara. I asked him how long he planned on dragging his pet rat around and he told me if I called it a rat again that I'd regret it. Sai suddenly had one of his fake smiles on, and Sakura noticed Emi let out a small hiss at the mention of the phrase rat. Gaara still wasn't meeting her eyes. So, either embarrassed about losing his temper, or... Sakura frowned. I don't like being lied to. It's not a lie. Sai countered. I did call her a rat and I do regret it. You both are hopeless. There would be no dragging a real answer out of them, but Sai was missing enough tact that Sakura could almost believe he'd somehow pushed Gaara to that point. Gaara was very fond of his Tanuki friend. Either way, if it wasn't the truth, it seemed as though Sakura wasn't going to drag the answer out of them. She sighed before making her way to Sai, reaching out to gently touch at his face. The boy flinched at first, but eventually settled. It's bad. Sakura commented. I wouldn't piss off Gaara, all right? He's got all that sand on his body, so his punches land like rocks. Let's go to the healers. They can patch you up and give me my final checkup. Right. And Gaara. Sakura turned to her friend, who definitely was showing the proper amount of shame for giving his comrade a black eye. Compared to the Gaara she'd first met, it was growth, in a way. The Gaara from her Chiryunin exam wouldn't have batted an eye at causing someone pain. Apologize, please. Sakura insisted, her voice gentle. I don't want there to be any bad blood between us going forward. We have enough problems to deal with already. I know Sai has a hard time holding his tongue, but that's no excuse to hurt him like this. Sorry. Gaara mumbled. It wasn't perfect, but a start was better than nothing. And Sai? You should apologize too. Emi means a lot to Gaara. Sai turned to Gaara, that same emotionless smile on his face. I'm sorry I call your rat a rat. I'll be sure to lie about it in the future. Sakura saw Gaara twitch a little, but the situation thankfully didn't escalate. Sakura thwopped Sai on the shoulder with her hand. The boy still had a lot to learn, it seemed, but for now, a start was a start. In the end, 8 Taki shinobi left the village with Sakura and her companions. Shivuki, of course, was there, along with 4 shinobi that he trusted with his life. They had decided upon taking one singular team to compete in the Chiryunin exams, consisting of Fu and 2 others, Kigon and Yoro. Both of Fu's teammates were already high-ranking by village standards, but the exams weren't about promotions for the Taki shinobi. They were about proving Taki's strength, and sharing knowledge of demons with the other villages. For Fu in particular, the exams were a show and she was the star. It would be all of the Taki shinobi's first time out of the Taki borders. Sakura would have gone as far as to consider it a historic event. Regardless of whether or not the pact continued to go well, this was the first time in several generations that Taki had allowed interaction with other villages at all. It was also the safest Sakura had ever felt while traveling. Even if a demon did show up, or if a bandit was stupid enough to challenge them, they'd be dealing with a grand total of a dozen shinobi, all of whom were competent and fully prepared to defend their precious comrades. There was no need to take shifts. As head ambassador, the others insisted she get her rest. And Sakura couldn't help but wonder if they were worried that she hadn't yet fully healed. It was a week-long journey to Konoha, which gave her plenty of time to speak freely with Shivuki about things she hadn't yet found the time to discuss. Akatsuki was foremost on his mind after her and Fu's run-in, which was an excellent segue into the only other member that Sakura hadn't been able to investigate yet, Kakuzu. Kakuzu had worn a Taki headband, so Sakura had been able to deduce he'd been from the village. But upon mention of the name, Shivuki had first reacted with confusion. Kakuzu? That shinobi's still alive. Either that or someone else with a Taki headband is going around by his name. That's unfortunate. Shivuki had glanced towards his fellow shinobi at the mention, worry growing on his face. Kakuzu was a shinobi under Taki decades ago. We had ordered him to assassinate Hashirama Senju after our negotiations had failed, in the hope that the Baijuyu might be set free without Hashirama to subdue them. Kakuzu failed and was punished, but he retaliated, killing many of our elders and stealing away with several of our prized technique scrolls. We'd heard he'd moved to mercenary life, but to think he would still be alive. Someone who'd been ordered to assassinate the first Hokage. Such a shinobi was definitely powerful, and if even Taki didn't know what Kakuzu had up his sleeve, then certainly nobody else would. Sakura would be in the dark about that member of Akatsuki for now. She would talk with Shivuki a lot, mostly about Taki traditions, sometimes about the legend of Kagaya. But perhaps the most important part of their journey had been the first night, and it had not been with Shivuki at all. As they had settled in for camp, Gaara already offering first watch, Kakashi came to her once everyone else had begun to doze. He sat down next to her, and for once that book of his was nowhere in sight. Kakashi-sensei. Ma, well, it's your birthday, isn't it? Sakura was stunned. She didn't remember telling Kakashi when her birthday was, and for him to remember it was even more of a shock. She just nodded, and that was all it took for Kakashi to pull something out. Well, I thought maybe, well, I've never been very good at this sort of thing. He pressed something into her hands. It was a kunao, but not like one she'd ever seen before. This kunao had a 3-pronged blade, and wrapped around the hilt was a cloth, on which were written symbols she had never seen before. It looked worn, but still oddly beautiful. What is dash? It belonged to my teacher. Kakashi explained. Minato-sensei, he gave it to me to celebrate my becoming a jounin. He told me, as long as I kept the blade, I would never be alone. He scratched the back of his head while he talked, chuckling. Well, what I didn't know at the time was that he used these kunao for his Flying Thunder God technique. He used these kunao as an anchor point to teleport to. But now that he's not around anymore, it's just a very versatile blade. Still, it's the sentiment that matters, I think. As long as I keep it, Sakura couldn't help but smile as she turned the kunao over in her hand. As she did, Kakashi reached out to put a hand on her head. I'm a Konoha shinobi through and through. But you're still my cute student. Next time someone tries to hurt you, you won't be alone. Thanks, Kakashi-sensei. She looked up to meet her sensei's eyes. He looked almost apologetic. Did he feel guilt, perhaps, for not being there when she'd faced Taki? Sakura squeezed the kunao tight. Even if it was just sentiment, Kakashi couldn't be there all the time, but what mattered was that he'd be there when he could. He'd come to find her in IWA, began to teach her like she'd always wanted. Kakashi wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And maybe, just maybe, succeeding a little bit. It wasn't a glamorous birthday, but Sakura felt as though she would always remember it. As they traveled, she often played with the kunao in her hand. It had an odd weight to it that would take getting used to, but she felt that its uniqueness would make for a weapon in combat that not many would expect. It was as she did this that she noticed Sai occasionally glancing at the blade. It was more interest than he usually placed in things, so at their next camp she sat down and showed it to him. "You keep looking at it. Did you want to see it closer?" "Not the kunao," Sai admitted. "But, the seals around the hilt. That blade belonged to the fourth Hokage." "Yup," Sakura confirmed. "Figures you'd recognize it. Seals are your thing, huh?" It wasn't just the fourth Hokage's technique. Sai reached out, and Sakura handed him the kunao to look at. The second used it as well, though his seals were very different. It's said that the fourth deduced the technique by looked at the second's seals. He's the only one who has ever been able to master it since. "Really? I guess they did say the fourth was a genius." Sakura grinned, leaning forward to watch Sai. "But, you know, you did invent a sealing jutsu all your own. Maybe you could figure this one out." "I doubt it. These seals are almost nonsensical. They're nothing like Konoha standard seals. I'd wager a guess that he picked up techniques from the Uzumaki, considering he married one." Sai hesitated, looking up to Sakura. "The Jinchuriki, Naruto, does he know anything about seals?" "I doubt it. He didn't know his parents after all, and I don't think they left him anything." "I highly doubt that's true. But Konoha might have kept his inheritance from him in an effort to conceal his heritage." Sai handed the kunao back to Sakura, and took on an almost sullen look. "Perhaps, now that he is older, the Hokage might be convinced to allow him his heritage. Which means you can ask him for help with the seal." Sakura reached out to poke Sai's shoulder. "You're insidious, you know that. You haven't even met him yet." "I know. But I should plan ahead for what to say when I meet him, right? Otherwise I might get another black eye." Sai smiled, and there was a hint of genuineness there this time. Sakura couldn't help but laugh at that. It was on the fourth day that they reached the Konoha border, and there someone was waiting for them. Sakura sensed them before she saw them, having spent the day trying to hone her newly sensitive sensing jutsu. "Kakashi-sensei, 6 shinobi ahead." "Oh." Kakashi smiled. "That would be the Konoha escort for the Taki entourage. I sent a request for them." "An escort?" Sakura let herself run ahead. If the Hokage knew she was coming, that would meant that it was likely whatever escort she decided would be. "Sakura." Sakura saw Orange flying towards her, and had just enough time to brace herself as she was enveloped in Naruto's arms. She clung to him tightly, not realizing until now just how much she'd missed him. "You finally made it." Naruto squeezed her until she thought she might not have any breath left at all. "Yup." Sakura agreed with a small gasp. "I'm back, Naruto." Chapter 43. Naruto filled their time traveling with words, to the point where Sakura was convinced he'd learned how to exist without taking in air. Perhaps it was because they had been apart so long, but Naruto felt the need to tell her everything that she had missed. Not even just what he had been up to, but what Ino had been up to, and Shikamaru and Chuji and Hinata and Kiba and Shino and, well, the list went on. To the dismay of the Ino Shikacho trio, who were also along for the journey and, as Ino pointed out, perfectly capable of telling Sakura exactly what they'd each been up to, "Thank you very much." But Naruto's excitement held a bit of nostalgia in Sakura's eyes, and she found it funny that while in the past she might have found Naruto's ranting a bit annoying, at this moment it was the most comforting thing in the world. At the moment he was discussing his training under Tsunade, and in light of the upcoming Chunin exams, that had expanded beyond the Hokage training that Naruto had been put under in the past. "She told me that she won't even think of passing me unless my chakra control is better, So she's been making me stand on the side of the Hokage monument while using wind chakra to keep a leaf a meter above my head. Which means I have to blow out wind chakra for a whole hour. Naruto lamented as they walked, and it finally dawned on Sakura how Naruto was able to talk in such long bursts now. Had Tsunade realized what she was encouraging by refining his wind jutsu? It took me 2 weeks to be able to do it for that long, but now she wants me to stand on a waterfall while doing it, and it has to be exactly a meter above my head or else I have to start over. She's brutal, Sakura. I think I'm gonna die before the exams even start. Sakura just laughed at this. As much as Naruto grouched, she knew he wouldn't begrudge training that made him stronger, and chakra control was just the area he was lacking. Tsunade was doing right by him. Don't even talk, Naruto, I'd take the damn waterfall training over what I've got. Ino piped in. My mom's making sure I build up poison immunity by nearly killing me with them. I've barely been able to keep down food without heaving. Though, Ino looked down at herself, grinning. My figure's the best it's ever been, don't you think, Forehead? It's pretty good for a stick, Ino pig. Sakura stuck out her tongue. Haven't you heard? Muscles are the new beautiful. It was at that moment that Fu, who had been quiet since the Konoha shinobi arrived, finally found the courage to pipe up. Yeah. She exclaimed suddenly, startling both Ino and Naruto as she thrust her way into the conversation. I mean, look at Pinky. She could lift a bear and she's perfect. Sakura felt a flush come to her cheeks, and Ino sputtered as she tried to argue back. Why yeah, well, you just haven't seen what a lean, mean, fighting machine can do. I'll just have to show you at the exams Ino frowned. I don't know your name yet. I'm Fu, I'm only the greatest and most powerful kunoichi in all of Taki Dash. And then it was Fu's turn to ramble on. Sakura couldn't help but notice a dismayed look on Shikamaru's face as they walked. The introvert was probably in his own personal hell having 3 long-winded talkers in his vicinity. Sakura wanted nothing more than to take Shikamaru aside for a chat, but not now. She caught his eye and he gave her a small shrug, but she knew from his glance that he understood. Later. Behind her walked Gaara and Sai, the former appearing a bit too shy to join in the conversation proper yet, and the latter looking as though he was taking notes. Sakura let herself slow down enough to peek at the words. Sai had written down the names of every new shinobi in the group, as well as a series of descriptive factors. She noted with a snort that Ino had been jotted down as Ino Pig. Sai was going to suffer if he called her that, but it was a learning experience, right? It was when she saw Jiraiya's notes that she held pause. Though her peers had gotten perhaps sillier descriptions, Shikamaru had been compared to a pineapple, Jiraiya had simply gotten 2 words, Sunin, dangerous. Sai was working on Asuma now, the Jounin in charge of the Ino Shikacho squad, and while the word stinky had been written next to the name, referring to the cigarette, perhaps, Asuma too had a more serious description. Sai was very good at taking succinct notes. A testament to his time en route, perhaps, but Sakura was realizing how useful his blunt observations might be for her own situation. Sai could read a room while she was occupied with interacting with it, and he could definitely notice things that she might miss. She gave Sai a warm smile before turning her attention back to the squabbling in front of her. The conversation had swung from Ino and Fu competing over the most powerful kunoichi title to Naruto and Fu getting ready to just throw hands in general. Naruto had always been a sucker for a challenge, and Fu seemed to get a kick out of riling him up. Could she tell, Sakura wondered, that Naruto held the Kyuubi inside of him? She'd told the Taki shinobi that her old teammate was the Jinchuriki, but... well, either way, it was probably good for both of them to interact. She could tell that Gaara, too, wanted to join in, if only just to have a chance to speak with Naruto for the first time since their own Chunin exams. There was so much to do, and a whole month before the exams were even set to begin. Sakura needed to convince the visiting cage to join her pact, if they hadn't already, and also find a way to aid Shikamaru in taking down Root. Sai wouldn't be free until Root was exposed. Konoha wouldn't be able to move forward until its dark past was ripped into the light. And on top of all of that, Sakura just wanted to see her friends and family again. For all she knew, once the exams were done, it might be the last time she saw them for a long while. It was a further 2 days' journey to Konoha's walls, and Sakura had hoped for a stress-free trip. But when Jiraiya approached her during their first night's rest, Sakura felt a pit in her stomach. Sunin. Dangerous. Jiraiya was Naruto's mentor too, and while that normally would have been enough to put her at ease, now Sakura just felt uncertain. Other than Kakashi and the shinobi her age, she wasn't sure who in Konoha that root had their claws in. Jiraiya was a known hermit and, by Naruto's claims, a bit of a lecher, but all of that could have been an act to keep his real intentions unknown. She had to tread carefully until the truth was brought to light. "Hey there, kid." Jiraiya held up a hand in greeting as he came near. "We need to talk, if you don't mind. Just you and me." Sakura felt Gaara tense at the last part, and she didn't blame him. The last time he'd let her go somewhere without him, well, Jiraiya wasn't Itachi, and Sakura knew that nothing could happen to her here without everyone in their group being aware of it. Sakura gave Gaara's hand a squeeze before standing up. She was an ambassador, damn it all, and she couldn't let herself be afraid of a talk. He took her to a section of the woods that was far enough away that the rest of the camp couldn't hear. There, he sat down on a log with a heavy sigh. Sakura couldn't help but notice that the man seemed tired, worn thin. She might have jokingly chalked this up to mentoring Naruto full-time, but this was different. She sat down on a stump across from him, doing her best to look professional. "What did you want to talk about, sir?" "Please, just Jiraiya." The man replied with a wave of his hand. "If you're going to take on such a big project, kid, you need to realize that it puts you on the same level as the cage. Someone like me won't be worth wasting the pleasantries. I still feel as though I should respect all I speak with, Jiraiya sir." Sakura pointedly made a note of including the title again. "It would be rude of me to think myself above others." A nice sentiment, but there are going to be people who take that as a sign of weakness. You're getting into a game you don't know all the rules to yet. Jiraiya reached into his pocket, pulling out a scroll that looked familiar. Her scroll, Sakura realized, the one she'd had Sai sent to Tsunade months ago. It was a breath of relief to know he'd actually sent it. Back then, she hadn't been sure. "This stuff on Akatsuki is pretty good," Jiraiya admitted. "But you got lucky that they didn't see you as a threat. Luck seems to be my dominant trait lately." "Well, you're gonna need it, kid." Jiraiya sighed again. "You know, Naruto thinks the world of you. But Konoha? Most are going to see you as a traitor. Tsunade is only tolerating you coming here because you're offering her something more than your life is currently worth. Information. Alliances." Sakura frowned. "Is there a point to all of this, or did you just want to lecture me?" "I'm saying that I want you to succeed, and you aren't going to unless you figure a couple things out. You've gotten lucky that old man Onaki's lost a few of his fangs, and you've gotten lucky to impress anyone from Taki at all. Not even Hashirama managed what you've done here. But now you're walking into a lion's den. Suna is going to be coming to the exams, and it's not just because of social obligation. They want their Jinhuriki back and they're not going to take no for an answer." "Gaara," Sakura glanced to the camp, biting her lip. "Gaara left of his own free will. If he doesn't want to return, Suna can't make him." "Maybe not. But Suna can absolutely refuse to sign your treaty. You've pissed them off, and there's not going to be a way to luck yourself out of this. What you need to figure out is what to give them that's worth more than Gaara's life, and that's a big life you're gambling with. And right now, Konoha is stuck in the middle. We're allied with Suna, currently, but also tied onto this pact. If Suna doesn't sign on, that screws us over too. Do you think Suna is going to stay aligned to someone who supports the theft of their Jinhuriki?" Jiraiya's eyes narrowed. "If you, and I mean you, don't sort this out, it could mean war." Sakura swallowed. She hadn't considered yet how Suna would react to the pact. She hadn't really been considering Suna at all. And not only that, she could be putting her home in jeopardy if she failed. Out of habit, her hand went up to touch her amulet. She'd gotten lucky before. This time everything was on her. But something is looking after me. Something I don't understand yet. Something that didn't want me to suffer attack as Sherry Non. Things didn't happen for no reason. Something saved her, and she wasn't going to be saved just to fail at the next step. I understand, Jiraiya. Sakura replied. I will take care with my interactions with Suna, and I will do my best to ensure a satisfactory conclusion for all involved. Well, you listen a bit better than Naruto does, at least. Jiraiya seemed less tense with her proclamation. And for all our sakes, I hope your luck holds out. He stood up, pocketing her scroll again as he did. Also, don't think I haven't noticed that amulet of yours. It seems rather similar to the one you described our Akatsuki friend wearing. Sakura flushed at this. He gave it to me. As I mentioned in the report, there seems to be a group that venerates the same god, and this amulet is their symbol. If I wear it, it's possible I'll be able to approach them and learn more about Haiden's abilities. Jiraiya chuckled at this. Well, you've certainly planned things out. But keep this in mind, all right. He met her eyes, and Sakura felt a twinge of fear as the man stared her down. If I think you're going to do anything that threatens Konoha, either through this treaty or anything else, I won't hesitate. Even against a kid like you. I know you won't, Jiraiya sir. Sakura stayed close to Gaara and Sai after that. What had once felt like a relieving trip home now felt like she was walking into a web of tripwire. One wrong move could start a war. One wrong move could lead to Sai's death, or even her own. One wrong move and everything fell apart. She spent her time trying to distract herself. She almost felt jealous seeing Naruto interact with the Inoshikacho trio, but in the same thought she felt an overwhelming joy for Naruto. Team 7, she had deluded herself into thinking that Team 7 had camaraderie, but it was nothing compared to what Naruto had found here. Even Solen Shikamaru seemed drawn to Naruto's energy, and the team seemed to gravitate around him, no matter the context. Sakura didn't miss that Ino seemed to always be looking Naruto's way, even when he wasn't paying attention to her. Did Ino still think about Sasuke, she wondered, or perhaps Naruto had grown several inches since she'd seen him last, and while his outfit still held traces of his favorite obnoxious orange, he'd since traded in for something a bit more battle practical. His longer coat reminded her a bit of Tsunade's style, and Sakura saw now that he kept not just kunao, but medicinal pouches and scrolls on his person. And with his hair a bit more grown out, Sakura could definitely see his resemblance to the late 4th Hokage. Had Jiraiya told him of his heritage yet? Sakura wasn't sure, but she did know that Naruto would know about his birthright before she had to leave Konoha again, even if she had to tell him herself. Regardless, Naruto wasn't exactly a boy anymore. He was a teenager in full now, and though at times he appeared a bit too gangly for his own body to sort out, he was still growing up. They all were. Eventually, around midday of their 6th day of travel from Taki, they reached the Konoha gates. Sakura saw familiar shinobi, patrolling, manning the gates, and while they put on a pleasant air, Sakura couldn't help but notice that their smiles faltered when they saw her. Even more painful to witness was the old team that Tsunade had assigned her to, back before she'd left the village. They didn't even bother hiding their contempt. Traitor indeed. Jiraiya had been right. Being here wasn't going to be pleasant. Konoha was a village known for its bonds, and she had broken them. Even if it was for a good cause. Sakura felt herself inching even closer to Gaara as they walked to the Hokage's tower. No one would attack her while she was here, she was certain of that, but Sakura still couldn't help but be afraid. Shibuki went to speak with Tsunade first, and for that Sakura was grateful. It was a small delay for her to gather her inner strength for facing the Hokage. Kakashi would be with her, and that was a comfort as well, but Jiraiya had said it himself, Tsunade only tolerated her now because she was more useful as she was than a dead missing nin. Eventually, the time came, and with a shaky breath Sakura made her way into the Hokage's office. Sakura Harano. Lady Tsunade. Sakura made sure to bow in the Hokage's presence. Respect here was paramount. Thank you for receiving me, and for the ESC-. Oh, cut the crap, Harano, and sit down. Sakura flinched, but quickly sat. Tsunade didn't look angry, per se, but she didn't exactly look pleased to see her either. For a moment, the two sat in silence. Gaara took a place at her side, but Sai stayed in the shadows by the wall, looking as though he'd rather not be seen. And then, finally, Tsunade spoke. I suppose it'd be hypocritical of me to be angry with you. And no, I think you are well within your right. I was 25 when I left Konoha, Harano. A several decade sabbatical, one that was definitely not approved by the Hokage at the time. But whereas I went and drank and gambled myself into obscurity, you left and somehow convinced Iwa and Taki that inter-village relations might be worth pursuing. I'm angry, Harano, but I can't stay angry. Not yet, anyway. If you leaving the village means never having to have another war again, then as far as I'm concerned, you're the best shinobi to ever leave this place. But we're not there yet. Sakura finished for her. But we're not there yet. Tsunade agreed. And because we're not there yet, I can make sure you know what a foolishly lucky idiot you've been, running off on your own. You are a child. This responsibility should not be on your shoulders. But the responsibility of being a genin can be. Sakura countered. Kakashi was a jounin at my age, Lady Tsunade dash. And it wasn't right. Sakura blinked. This wasn't the direction she'd expected this conversation to go. I'll support your treaty, Harano. I'll sign it in full, myself, now that you're here. But I will only continue to support you on 2 conditions. Sakura hastily pulled out a scroll to write. Conditions, of course, conditions. The first is that you will work to an inter-village agreement that all future genin must be 18 years or older before allowing to participate in war activities or any mission rank above D. 18. It seemed so old, considering that she'd been a genin for 2 whole years now. Why 18 specifically? She asked. Why not 17 or 19? Because I have sufficient evidence through my years of medical study and my work with the Yamanakas on psychology that one's brain continues to develop long into one's 20s. But around the age of 18, most begin to learn the maturity needed to properly approach higher-ranked mission. It is my belief that allowing our children more time to grow and develop will lead to lower mortality rates in both war and peacetime, as well as better stability in shinobi that survive to later adulthood. Tsunade leaned forward, looking more serious than Sakura had ever seen her. I'm tired seeing children being broken by war, Harano. I'm tired and I'm done. Whether or not this is implemented into your pact, I will be moving to implement it here. My soldiers won't be children. My soldiers won't fight children. If you push for this, you will have my full support. Sakura could be sympathetic to the thought. Convincing the other villages, however. Well, Lady Tsunade, through the tenets of the pact, we can put forth motions to be added as addendums. However, these addendums must be agreed upon through popular vote. You talked about having sufficient evidence, so I would recommend putting this evidence together so that we can present it to the other cage. However, with that in mind, Sakura met Tsunade's gaze, determined. I will put forth this proposal yearly until the other villages comply and allow the amendment to be added. Good. Tsunade nodded. And now for my second condition. Right. I want you to establish a medical division among your ambassadors, Harano. And I want this medical division to compile knowledge from every country to be publicly available to anyone who requires it. Oh. Sakura felt relief. This request, this was easier. Well, while I cannot force any village to share medical knowledge with me, I can still meet this requirement without much hassle. Until I have more ambassadors to fully dedicate to the role, I can take on this request personally and start a repository for any knowledge you are willing to share. I will make it known that anyone who approaches me will have free access to it. I find that acceptable, Tsunade replied. Give that pact over, I'll get the damn thing signed. If you're going to start a fire, Harano, we'd better make it a big one. Sakura didn't stay with Tsunade for much longer. She was tired from the journey, and more importantly had somewhere important to go before she addressed anything else. Stay close to Gaara and me, she warned Sai as they walked. Actually, I think it's best if you don't leave our view while we're here, okay? I'm a bit worried. Only a bit. Sai retorted. You might be underestimating the situation. Sakura stuck her tongue out before continuing to walk. Listen, everything you're worried about right now isn't going to even compare to what we're about to walk into. So please, Sai, try not to say anything that will get you killed. In fact, just let me do most of the talking, alright? And what are we about to walk into? Well. Sakura swallowed, turning a familiar corner until a certain house was in sight. It was achingly familiar, and Sakura had never been more nervous, even when facing down Cage. This is my house. Sakura told them. And the two of you are about to meet my mom and dad. Chapter 44, Alekheim, Intermission Part 8. What? A revolution. The pale-haired boy looked back and forth between Sasuke and Karen. Sasuke had let Karen do the talking, of course. He wasn't really one for charismatic talks anyway, and it was really Karen who was the brains of this operation regardless. Every time Orochimaru slinked out of hearing range, times that were few and far between, he and Karen worked to pull in another person to their side. Suijutsu was a bit of a wild card. He'd been captured by Orochimaru and used for experimentation, and even now the boy was kept in a sealed water tank, unable to leave without the seal's removal. If that means I get to cut that bastard snake up, sure. But then you'll probably just stick me back in the tank once you're done, won't you? Suijutsu gave Karen a grin. Not at all. Karen shook her head. The plan is simply to ensure your freedom when hell breaks loose, with the promise that you won't harm any of our people. After that, you go where you please. And what if I want to cut you up too, huh? You've done just as much damage to people like me as the snake has. Karen glanced at Sasuke. Sasuke in turn looked to Suijutsu. He activated his Sharingan, and with a small push of his thumb moved the blade of his sword slightly out from his sheath. Suijutsu laughed. Ah, so you'll sick your dog on me? Priceless, but at least you've got a contingency plan. A future Otokage has to be prepared. Karen retorted. I've even got a little something extra for you that'll whet your appetite. You help us out with this revolution, and I'll point you in the direction of something real nice. This, Sasuke had not heard from her yet. He turned to her, as confused as Suijutsu. He saw a smile spread across Karen's face. What if I told you I could point you in the direction of the same Hada? Oh, that was good. Even Sasuke could admit that. Karen wasn't just pulling Suijutsu to her side, she was fulfilling her end of the bargain to him. Itaki had last been seen in the company of the rogue Kisame Hoshigaki. Sasuke remembered seeing the monster of a sword in that shinobi's hands, and if Suijutsu wanted same Hada, he could be a distraction. Keep Kisame off his back while he approached Itaki. Karen really was a clever girl. And Suijutsu had taken the bait. His smug look had transformed to one of interest, and he leaned forward in the water, now very serious. Listen, Uzumaki. You point me in the direction of that sword and I'll do whatever your little heart desires. I'll be the one to unite the 7 swords of Kiri once again. That is a promise. Unite them. Sasuke spoke up. So you would want the Kyubikurei Basho, would you not? Well, duh, Uchiha, that's what uniting them means. Then you'll get the blade, once Karen is Otokage. Then, if you still desire same Hada, I shall lead you to it. Our goals will align. Sasuke pressed an open hand against the glass. They could not shake hands, but this was the next best thing. I will swear if you do. Suijutsu did not hesitate. His hand also pressed the glass, mirroring Sasuke. Better keep that promise. Just when will this little revolution be anyway? Not soon. Karen explained. We have much to do. But when the time comes, she pulled out a violet bandana, making a show of wrapping it around her arm. Our people will be wearing these. You got that? No chopping up anyone on our side. Fine, fine. No chopping purple. But you know, Orokai's not stupid. He's probably already aware you're up to something. I know. In fact, I'm counting on it. Karen insisted. But I've got a trump card. While Orochimaru is dealing with the threat he thinks is in front of him, he misses something obvious right next to him. Don't you even worry. Sasuke wasn't sure what Karen's trump card was, but as the two of them left Suijutsu's chamber, she did not seem to lose any of her confidence. She was sure of herself, which meant Sasuke had to be too. The day was coming. The day where he would be strong enough to face his brother. But before that, Kabuto had told him that Sakura had aided a rebellion in the newly dubbed land hidden in plains. And Sasuke was never one to let anyone show him up. Sakura Haruno has arrived, sir. Along with the traitor. Danzo did not look from his papers. This was typical for him. His agents would often give dozens of reports throughout the day, and if he was too distracted from his other workings by said reports, he'd never finish anything. This news, specifically, did not come as a surprise to him. He had known for several days now that the newly dubbed Shinobi Ambassador would arrive within the village walls, along with the agent she had wrestled away from him. Her arrival was simply one step of many in his plans. Estimated time for others. Tsunagakure's shinobi will be arriving in 8 days. IWA will arrive in 10, and the new planes in similar time. Kusa and Tani will arrive in 2 weeks' time. AIM is yet unconfirmed. Kyumo has declined Konoha's invitation, and Kiri is likely still in upheaval, so they are not expected to arrive. You are dismissed. The agent left, as silently as he had arrived. 2 weeks, then, until everyone had arrived. 2 weeks to ensure every piece was in place. There was much to do, so much to do, always so much. But for Konoha? Danzo would do anything. In the darkness of his room, Shikamaru moved pieces on a dusty board. With near-silent taps, he pushed piece after piece into place. He did not stop until each side was set up in starting position. The starting positions, however, were not equal. That was not how this game had begun. The opposing side had gotten a plethora of time to set up their pieces. To some, the game might have seemed decided from the start. But Shikamaru wouldn't give up this game so easily. He moved a single piece on his side of the board. It might be some time before he could move a piece again. All of the pieces had not yet arrived. In a small box next to the board, the remaining pieces waited. There was still time. And Shikamaru had one advantage that the enemy did not. He was aware of all of the pieces on the board. The enemy was not. Chapter 45. If Sakura had to decide which of her two parents she'd gotten her personality from, without a doubt she would have said her father. It was Kaizashi himself who answered the door, and the silence was over in a split second as he called out her name and pulled her into a bear hug that threatened to crack open her spine. Sakura was grateful for Gaara's restraint. She knew the boy was defensive, and through her father's arms she saw floating sand around her at the ready, held back only by Gaara's realization that she wasn't, in fact, in danger. Hey Dad, Sakura managed to wheeze. Good to see you too. You are in so much trouble, young lady. Kaizashi pulled away so he could look Sakura in the eyes, and though his tone was angry, Sakura could see genuine relief on his face. Leaving the village with a note like that, how could you do this to your father? I've been worried sick. I'm sorry, Sakura winced, already prepared for the lecture that was to come, and boy did it. Her father had quite the set of lungs on him, and once he got started the lecture didn't stop. And Sakura knew what to expect. Worrying her mother sick, wondering where she was, wondering if she was alive or dead. Sakura stole a glance behind her, curious what the boys were thinking. Gaara looked confused, but Sai looked curious. Sakura wondered if Sai even knew who his own parents were. And Gaara, of course, never known his mother, and with the way his father treated him. Did either of them know what a family was supposed to be like? Dad. Sakura interjected. I can take the lecture later, but I brought guests, you know? Can we at least take this inside? And I swear if you ever pull this Kaizashi halted, blinking as he looked over Sakura's shoulder. You brought guests? Well, why didn't you say so earlier? Get them on in here, we'll show them the Haruno hospitality. Kaizashi swung the front door wide open, gesturing for them to come inside. Sakura let the boys in first, hesitating at the entrance. Her father had stopped too, briefly looking towards the nearby houses. Sakura heard one window snap shut, and then another. Dad. Inside, little Shimei. We'll talk later. The house was as she remembered it, lined with bookshelves, all handmade by her father. Her mother had been the one to fill most of them. There were books on more subjects than Sakura had ever had the time to read: carpentry, architecture, cooking, sewing, politics, philosophy. Her father called her a bookworm, but it was her mother who'd earned the title long before she'd ever been born. Her mother was the head of the public library, meant for civilian use. Sakura had been surrounded by books since before she'd known how to walk. Coming back to this, seeing the rows and rows of pages, this was what home was to her. "We haven't touched your bedroom," Kaisashi admitted, putting a hand on her shoulder. "We knew it was only a matter of time before you came home. Just never expected you to go off so far. Earth country, Sakura, really?" "Yup." Sakura grinned. "I have a lot to tell you about. Wait till your mother gets home. Guess I'll be making dinner for 5 tonight." Sakura knew better than to interfere when her father had reign of the kitchen, and if they were going to be staying here a while, she needed to figure out living arrangements. Gaara didn't need a bed, but Sai definitely would, and there was a part of her that worried about leaving him in a room alone, even if he was technically protected under the neutrality pact. She led them upstairs, rummaging in a small closet along the way until she found an inflatable mattress. Once upon a time, when Ino used to stay the night, she'd use it so she had a place to sleep. It would do for Sai, Sakura supposed. Her room was untouched, as her father had claimed. Neatly organized, bed made, and a picture of Team 7 still in its primary spot on her dresser. There was a bit of dust on the frame, and Sakura lingered long enough to dust it off with her hand. Naruto had grown almost a foot since the picture had been taken, and she'd probably grown as well. And Sasuke, she could only wonder. "So that's the Uchiha." Sakura turned at the sound of Sai's voice. He was looking over her shoulder, frowning. "Doesn't look like much to me." "I wouldn't be so cocky." Sakura chuckled. "He was one of the strongest shinobi I knew before he left the village. Now that he's trained under Orochimaru, who knows how strong he's become." "So what?" Sai shrugged. "You've trained under the Tsuchikage. He's trained under the Otokage. Doesn't make him special. Just means he probably knows how to throw some snakes around." Sakura frowned. "You know, Sai, I could say the same about your people skills. You better watch your mouth around my parents, okay?" Sai put on one of his fake smiles. "Grumpy's right. You're still touchy about him, aren't you?" Sakura gently punched the boy's arm. "Idiot. He was my teammate." "Oh? Then what does that make us?" Sai rubbed his arm. "You were part of that team for 5 months. You've been with Gaara for more than half a year at least, if not close to a whole. Me, about just as long. But it's not very long at all. Not really. Yet you're willing to throw your life on the line for each of us. Isn't it strange, getting attached to someone like that so quickly? What, are you saying you'd rather I'd let Root have their way with you? And you're one to talk, you know." Sakura poked Sai in the chest, accusingly. "You're the one who decided to join up with us." "Yes. And it's certainly strange." His eyes flickered towards the window, and Sakura's followed suit. There was nothing there, just a few trees and the roofs of houses, but perhaps that's not what Sai saw. Root were elite shinobi, and Sakura was more than certain that several sets of eyes would be kept on her from the moment she set foot in the village until the moment she left. Now that she looked at Sai, she could see a small hint of fear and worry in his eyes. One misstep, and Sai's life was on the line. He wasn't just accusing her of being clingy, he was questioning himself. Questioning his own decision to break away from the only thing he'd ever known, questioning if he'd make it out of Konoha alive. Sakura reached out, this time gently putting her hand over Sai's own. "Strange isn't bad," she told him, forcing a smile. "Every great shinobi has been a little offbeat from everyone else. You don't make waves unless you're a bit strange." Her grin became more genuine as she thought of Naruto, as strange as you could get at times. Boisterous, mischievous, always clad in orange, he wasn't exactly what came to mind when one thought of a shinobi. But Naruto was going to be one of the greats, of that Sakura had no doubt. Sai looked downwards, not meeting Sakura's eyes. He still looked worried, to be sure, but there was something else there, something Sakura couldn't quite put a finger on. But he didn't pull away from her touch, so perhaps she'd said something right. Once her backpack was set down and her weapons unpacked, Sakura made her way back towards the stairs. She found Gaara there, looking at the portraits of her family that lined the wall. He had a hand out, touching the side of one of the frames. Gosh, that one's so old. Sakura chuckled as she looked. That particular picture, she'd been 6 years old. Her parents were holding her up in front of the academy, her very first day. Sakura had been grinning like a loon. Neither of her parents had been capable of becoming shinobi, their chakra reserves too small. But Sakura had made the cut. The first of the Haranos to be capable of joining. I look a bit like a dork, don't I? But I guess I was just a kid. It looks nice. It clicked all at once, and Sakura grinned slyly. We'll get a picture taken while we're here, all right? My parents have a camera. We can sit out back under the trees for a nice background. Gaara looked like a happy child at the mention of that, and Sakura couldn't help but giggle in excitement. The first photograph since. Well, since Team 7. Sakura's smile faltered. Was it strange that she felt guilty? Naruto had been so eager to see her, but really, after all this time, he was more a part of Team 10 than he ever had been part of 7. And now, much like Sai had said, she'd spent more time with him and Gaara than she'd spent with Naruto and Sasuke. It was almost like they'd been replaced. The thought weighed heavy on her mind as they made their way downstairs to the dining room, just in time to see her mother arrive. Mabuki Harano was far more reserved than her husband in demeanor, and instead of accosting her, she simply came and put a warm hand on her daughter's shoulder. Was it a good trip, Sakura? And maybe she had replaced Team 7, and maybe that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe, just maybe there hadn't been much of Team 7 left to salvage. She hadn't lost Naruto or Kakashi, she'd simply shifted her goals. And she'd gained Gaara and Sai. No, she shouldn't feel guilt over that. She doubted Naruto felt guilty. He would have simply told her to do what she thought was right. Yes. Sakura answered with a smile. I'd say it was pretty good. So you're the Kazekige's son? Ha, I knew my girl was making friends in high places. Kaizashi laughed heartily over his meal, and he reached out a hand to pat Gaara's back, completely missing the thin layer of sand that shielded Gaara from the touch. Course, Suna's got a new Kazekage from what I hear. We're supposed to see them at the upcoming exams, I think. There's many village Kage coming this year. Mabuki added. I believe it is because of you, Sakura. They are curious about the treaty. Well, I guess that's good. It means I won't have to travel to them. Do you know everyone who's coming, Mom? I hear rumors at the library. They say Aim's new Kage is going to be coming. No one knows who that is either, not since Hanzo's death. So, lots of surprises. Sakura groaned. The last thing I need while I'm here. Mom, if you can find out anything at all. You know I'll tell you. Mabuki gave a curt nod. And, who is the other boy you've brought to the table? Oh, that's Sai. Sakura looked nervously over at Sai, daring to send a prayer to Jashin that he wouldn't say anything weird. He's, another shinobi from here in Konoha, but he's joined up with me as an ambassador. It's good to meet you. Sai put on one of his trademark fake smiles. Your home is. Sakura held her breath. Sai paused, for about a moment too long. He was thinking, what would he say? Average. The table was quiet. Sakura noted that her father was mid-bite, and Gaara looked as though he was going to knock Sai across the table. Mabuki answered coolly. Said well by someone who embodies the word. Sakura spit her drink. She'd forgotten how slick her mother could be with her words. It seemed to catch Sai off guard, but he recovered quickly. I like your mother. He said simply. She knows how to act normally. Sakura groaned. Now Sai was just going to be encouraged. But, it wasn't the worst thing he could have said. Maybe, little by little, he was improving. Sakura found herself outside watching the sunset after dinner. Mabuki had already wrestled the boys into helping clean up, though secretly she knew that her mother was just trying to give her and her father some time alone. Kaizashi didn't take long to come sit outside next to her, a long pipe in hand. Sakura still hated the smell of smoke, but she'd given up convincing him out of the habit a long time ago. They're a little strange, those boys, but they'll do. Kaisashi commented, taking a long, deep breath of the night air. As long as they keep my little girl safe, that is. But it sounds like you've become a capable shinobi in your own right. I've certainly tried. Sakura admitted. As the first Harano shinobi, I have to make a statement, right? You've definitely done that. Kaizashi's eyes narrowed. They talk about you, you know. All the neighbors. The shinobi that passed through. Oh. Sakura remembered the glare of the shinobi at the gate. Were the civilians, too, thinking of her so poorly? Did rumors spread so quickly? We're the parents of a traitor to the village. Kaisashi continued. They don't understand what you're up to, I don't think. You need to watch yourself. We hear things, your mother and half the village thinks you're going to see the village to its downfall. Or that you really did take after your old teammate. I'm doing this for peace. And you know better than anyone that shinobi politics have led to plenty of wars in the past, little Shimai. Civilians suffer when shinobi go to war. We're caught in the crossfire. Only time will convince them that your treaty is for the greater good. And what do you think, Dad? Sakura looked to her father, desperate. Do you think it's a lost cause too? Course not. My little girl's the one running it. Bookwork and papers, that's always how you excelled at the academy. Fighting was never your strong suit, it was knowledge. Mabuki's the only one who can run that library because she can keep track of hundreds of issues at once. You're her daughter. Your mind is your weapon. He put a hand on her head, grinning from ear to ear. I don't care what those idiots next door think. You're my pride and joy, that didn't change even when you left home. I always knew you left for a good reason. Sakura smiled. Her parents had always been supportive, that much was true, but hearing the words was a confirmation she'd needed. I'll be in the basement, little Shimai. Do you want to lend me a hand? It had been well over a year since Sakura had helped her father with his woodworking. Ever since she'd become a shinobi, she'd always come home too exhausted. A part of her wanted to help him now, but she had time, and for now there was too much to think about. Tomorrow, maybe? Once I've had a good rest. I'll save you some work then. Her father rustled her hair one last time before leaving her alone. From there, it was quiet, with only the rustling of the leaves to keep her company. Her family's backyard had always been a peaceful place to study. Sakura had fond memories of her mother reading to her under the large tree in the back, and memories still of her and Ino planting flower seeds, with Ino telling her each one's meaning as they grew in. Her childhood had been a pleasant one, all things considered. How tragic to think that so many people precious to her hadn't been given that luxury. And how many more wouldn't get to experience that peace, having been forced into war at an early age. Having been made into jinhiriki, pulled into root. Sakura's fist clenched tight. She hadn't come home for a nice reprieve. She had 2 missions now, and she couldn't let herself get distracted. As if on cue, Sakura felt something. Energy, approaching her at a rapid pace. She closed her eyes, focusing on her sensing jutsu. Yes, that sort of energy was unmistakably. Orange landed in front of her, and a sloppy grin. Sakura, Sakura. Naruto tried to whisper, but his voice still held excitement. Come on, you gotta go. We're all meeting up at Shikamaru's. Shika's. Sakura blinked, then looked back towards the house. They can come too, right? Yeah, I think he said they could. Gaara and, Naruto paused for a moment, thinking. Sai. Sakura corrected him gently. Naruto, you need to get better at remembering names if you're going to be the Hokage, you know. Yeah, Granny's always telling me. Naruto crossed his arms with a frown. Then, he suddenly held his hand out, pretending to write on it with one finger. She showed me this thing that helps though. She says if you write a name on your hand 3 times then you never forget it. Oh really? Sakura couldn't help but smile at that. Tsunade had got Naruto figured out. Naruto learned better by doing. By combining action with the memorization, of course he'd remember things more easily. Sigh. What do you want? Naruto flinched as Sai appeared next to him. I didn't want you. I was just trying to, dash. Is my name so difficult to remember? So you're, brainless. Sai gave Naruto a smile, and Sakura winced. Naruto had never responded well to Sasuke's teasing, and Sai was even worse. Sure enough, she could practically see Naruto's blood begin to boil. Why you little dash? Naruto looked as though he was about to throw a punch. Then, all at once, Naruto stopped. He let out an angry grunt, then took a deep breath. Then, he began to pace, counting out loud as he did. 1, 2, 3, 4. What are you doing, Naruto? Sakura watched curiously. Granny says if someone I don't like says something irritating, I should take a deep breath and count to 20. Naruto insisted. Then, if I still want to punch them, they deserve it. 9, 10, 11. Maybe I should take some tips from Tsunade. Sakura admitted with a chuckle. If she could even get Naruto to hold his temper. Or maybe, just maybe, it was Naruto starting to grow up. It didn't take long for Gaara to join them, and then the four of them were leaping off into the night. Sakura realized that she'd never really been to the Nara compound before. It was on the outskirts of the village, bordering a forest that the Nara used to raise their deer herds. Outsiders were forbidden without the consent of the clan. Typically for all clans, usually, who were fairly protective of their clan secrets. That night, however, the Nara compound was full of visitors, familiar faces. Sakura was pleased to see Ino and Chuji, as well as Hinata, Kiba, and Shino. All of the remaining members of the Rookie Nine, a true homecoming. Chuji had brought snacks, of course, and with that Shikamaru began to lead them out into the woods. No shinobi can come out here into the Nara forest. Shikamaru explained to her as they walked. So, that means we can talk freely. We've been using this as a base for our top-secret S-ranked mission. S-ranked mission. Operation, Konoha Revival. Shikamaru rubbed the back of his neck. Naruto picked it, not me. If it's an S-ranked mission, it has to have a cool name. Naruto insisted. Otherwise what's the point? But before we talk, we need to straighten something out. Shikamaru stopped in his tracks, turning to face Sai. Rather, we need to straighten out things with you. Sai stopped as well, though he kept his smile on his face. Oh? So, unlike Brainless here, you can actually think. Sakura briefly caught sight of Naruto starting to pace again. Shikamaru, of course, was unfazed. You've claimed to have sided with Sakura and abandoned Root. But we have to confirm that's true. After all, what better way to ingratiate yourself to Root again than by exposing the shinobi that want to take them down? Sakura froze. It was something that she hadn't even considered, despite how obvious it was. Still, if she couldn't trust Sai, after everything. You can trust him. Sakura was surprised to see Gaara step forward. He had stayed quiet all during the Nine's reunion, and during the walk. In fact, ever since he'd stepped foot into Konoha's borders, he'd barely spoken much at all. He'd talked briefly with Naruto, but otherwise had kept his distance. It was Sakura who knew all of the Konoha shinobi, after all, not him, so perhaps Sakura could understand. She'd learned that Gaara had a shyness around those he wasn't used to. But now, to speak up to those strangers, in defense of Sai. If he wasn't trustworthy, he wouldn't be here. Gaara continued, glancing over to Sai as he spoke. He would be dead. Sakura felt a small chill fall over the group at that, though Sai didn't look nervous at all. If anything, Sakura could have sworn she felt relief. Sakura, Ino whispered in her ear. You know, I've read all your letters, but, Gaara still seems really scary. Sakura laughed nervously. Listen, he's just trying to make sure Shikamaru knows he's serious, that's all. And he's right. She straightened up, turning to face Shikamaru. Look, I trust him too. He's been by my side all this time and proven dash. No offense, Sakura, but I think I'll trust Gaara's words over yours in this instance. After all, you defended Sasuke to your last breath. Sakura's breath hitched, and this time Naruto couldn't hold back. He appeared in front of Shikamaru all at once, teeth bared. "Shikamaru, don't you dare bring Sasuke into this. This is precisely why I have to, Naruto. I know you and Sakura care about him, but he left us. It doesn't matter how much you trusted him, that didn't stop him from leaving. Your trust was misplaced," Shikamaru argued. "You both care about people deeply. I get that. That's precisely why I can't trust your judgment in this sort of situation. Sakura is the kind of person who will defend Sai to her last breath. Gaara, however, does not have this track record. If he trusts Sai, then Sai is trustworthy." Though Naruto had grown taller than Shikamaru, it was still Shikamaru that looked as though he was dominating the conversation. Even in his rage, Sakura realized, Naruto had come to respect Shikamaru's leadership. And to Sakura's surprise, Naruto stood down. Well, she couldn't let Naruto show her up in maturity. Sakura calmed herself, looking over to Gaara. "All right. So you can't trust my word, but you can trust Gaara's. So does that mean you're okay with Sai being here?" "Actually, I was sort of counting on him being here," Shikamaru admitted. "Now that the three of you are here, we can start discussing our plans." Choji brought out a picnic blanket, and the 10 of them sat and began to talk. Team 8 had been the most active since the mission had began. As a squad that specialized in reconnaissance, they'd been the most suited to gathering preliminary information about Root. Hinata in particular had proven, by coincidence, to be the best suited to the task, due to her being the heir to the Hyuga clan. Clan heads met periodically to discuss village politics, alongside the Hokage and the 3 elder council members. "I had the thought at one of the meetings that it would make sense for the head of Root to be someone who has a lot of influence," Hinata admitted. "But it couldn't be a clan head. The 3rd Hokage wouldn't have let one clan have so much influence. That narrowed it down to the 3 council members. That's when we had the bright idea to have Shino start bugging them," Kiba interjected. "It was super easy. Shino had a few of his bugs stay with Hinata during a meeting, then had them slowly make their way onto the council members while they were distracted with the talks. It only took a couple of days to confirm it." "Yes. It was easy to deduce," Shino confirmed. "Why?" "Because of the 3 council members, only one consistently went underground, meeting with dozens of shinobi daily. The other 3 mostly spend their time at home, or in the Hokage Tower to meet with Lady Tsunade. Thus, we concluded that it must be Danzo Shimura who is the head of Root." Nine Eyes looked towards Sai for confirmation. Sai blinked before speaking. "Well, I cannot exactly confirm or deny it," he said with a shrug before sticking out his tongue. Sakura briefly saw the black lines marking his seal. "I'm not allowed to speak of anything regarding Root secrets." "Then don't speak it," Shikamaru countered. "Just give a thumbs up if we're right." Sai blinked again. Slowly, he moved his hand to give Shikamaru a thumbs up. "Oh," Sai said. "Maybe it's Danzo who's been brainless this whole time. I imagine it's mostly meant to deter interrogators who think they can torture information out of you. If they see a seal like that, they might assume there's no possible way for you to give information without paralyzing yourself. Danzo never assumed a member of Root would turn on him." "Yes, perhaps so. That means we do have a confirmation method." Shikamaru grinned. "Perfect. That means we have at least one witness." "Witness?" Sakura thought for a moment. "You're planning on bringing Danzo to trial?" "Yes," Shikamaru confirmed. "But we can't do it yet. Root is an officially sanctioned Konoha organization. We can't bring Danzo to trial simply for leading an organization that the Hokage herself has allowed to exist. What we need is proof of Root's actual crimes." He pulled out a scroll, unrolling it for all to read. "Through Sakura and our own investigations, we have 2 leads. One is Root's removal of Konoha children to train in their program. It's not going to be enough to convict them of anything, they'll likely have covered their tracks and claim that these children willingly joined them. In fact, this is likely why Root has mostly focused on orphans for their recruits." However, Shikamaru gestured towards Shino. Shikamaru had originally thought that Root wouldn't dare risk taking clan children. "Why?" "For fear of invoking the wrath of the clan. Shino began. However, I can say with absolute certainty that this is not the case. This is because Root approached myself and my cousin when we were young in an attempt to recruit us. What? Sakura blinked. They tried to recruit you. Correct. Though I felt uneasy accepting Root's invitation, my cousin, who had recently lost his father, accepted the invitation. I believe he hoped to find purpose working in Konoha's underground. I have not seen him since, and thought little of it until recently. When I asked my parents what they believed happened to my cousin, they informed me that he had died on a mission. Since this conflicted with what I saw happen in my youth, I realized the possibility that Root might be misleading clans by claiming their shinobi had passed in battle, when in actuality they had been recruited. Following that logic, one could make the reasonable argument that Root has been taking children from clans without their permission. The clans will riot if they find out. Ino added. Every single clan is going to be questioning if their members have simply died, or if it was faked by Root. All we need on that front is to show that Shino's cousin has really been in Root all along. And Shino's already confirmed it. His Kakaicho could easily sense his cousin's hive. In terms of evidence, we got this one in the bag. Kiba said with a grin. So why wait? Sakura asked. Why not bring this up to the Hokage right away? Because that's not enough. Shikamaru explained. There are dozens of shinobi in Root, possibly a couple hundred. All of them are elite shinobi, potentially clan members. If we try to bring Root down, it's possible that Danzo will use it as an excuse to start a coup. Right now, he believes himself to be hidden, manipulating things from the shadows. That's how he likes it. If we bring him into the light, there's no longer a reason to behave himself. No point in letting the Hokage be his figurehead. He might just try to take over. So what you're saying is that it's pointless to go after Root. What we need to do is go after Danzo himself. Sakura confirmed. Right. Cut off the head and the body won't know what to do. Without Danzo, Root will likely fall apart. Even if they don't, they've been trained to be loyal to Konoha to the death. If not Danzo, they'll listen to the Hokage next. From there, Tsunade can disband Root and integrate the agents back into Konoha proper. Alright. But you mentioned 2 leads into Root, didn't you? I did. Shikamaru nodded. Though the second one has only come up recently, and it came from you, Sakura. You remember what you told me about what Itaka said to you? Wait, you met up with Itaka? Naruto spoke up. Where was he? What was he doing? We saw him on the border of Taki. Sakura explained. He confronted me and asked after Sasuke. When I told him he'd driven Sasuke off to Orochimaru, he suggested that it wasn't what he'd meant for Sasuke. And that someone had promised him they'd keep Sasuke safe. At first, I thought that Itaka might be delusional. Shikamaru began. After all, he murdered his entire clan, only leaving Sasuke alive. Why would there be anyone that condoned that behavior? Who would have promised Itaka anything after Itaka butchered a clan? It sounds like you might have an answer. Not yet. Nothing confirmed. But it's a lead we have to follow. And that's where our current plans come into play. There are 2 places we can look to find out more information about Itaka. Shikamaru pointed to Naruto. And Naruto is our best man for the first place. That's right, I'm the best. Naruto grinned. Wait, why am I the best? The Hokage has files on every shinobi that has ever existed in the village. I would wager even those who have gone rogue. What I need first is access to all of Itaka's files, and as the Hokage's pupil, you, Naruto, are in the best position to get a hold of them. So, Naruto, this is your new mission, assigned by me. Get me that file, and make sure nobody knows you've gotten it. Especially not Root. Roger. Naruto saluted. You know me, I'm the stealthiest shinobi around. I'll get you those files no problem. Let Team 8 be your backup, Naruto. If anything seems too troublesome, use them to help you out. And that leaves Team 10 and Sakura's group for my second mission. Shikamaru continued. And that mission is potentially the most dangerous of all. What we need to do, is infiltrate and investigate the Uchiha clan compound. Sakura swallowed. Shika, If you get caught doing that, it might be considered treason. If I get caught doing that, it could undo everything I've set out to accomplish with the Neutrality Pact. Nobody in any village would ever trust me again. You're right. Shikamaru agreed. In fact, outside of Sasuke, nobody has been allowed inside the clan compound since the massacre. Or rather, nobody is capable of getting inside. It's sealed by a powerful barrier that will only allow those of Uchiha blood to enter. Even getting inside to clean up the massacre took the work of the Hokage and several Seal Masters in order to breach it. Seal Masters that I theorize may have been a part of Danzo's route. If Root did the cleanup, doesn't that mean there's probably nothing left there of use? Potentially. It's possible we won't find anything of use at all. But I have an inkling we might just find something if we know where to look, and in order to get inside, I need your help specifically, Sakura. Me. Sakura frowned. I don't really know any seal work, Shika. Neither do I. Shikamaru agreed. Thankfully, if we play our cards right, we won't need any seal work. Remember when I asked you to send me a list of all of the skills you had at your disposal? Yeah, about a month ago, right? Sakura nodded. So you're saying something I know how to do can help? Bingo. Shikamaru agreed. And I can almost guarantee that we won't get caught. All we need to ensure is that nobody will know that you're missing for a long period of time. For that, we need Ino. Me. Ino pointed at herself. How so? Sakura's been your friend since you were children. It's only natural she'd want to spend a day catching up with you, right? Shikamaru pointed out. And Gaara, you've spent all this time with Sakura. Do you think you could effectively make a sand clone and mimic her for a few hours? Yes. But I couldn't go far from it. You won't have to. I know you won't like it, but everyone expects you and Sai to be joined to Sakura's hip while she's here. While your sand clone is with Ino, you and Sai will be nearby to watch over it, still playing the part of her bodyguards. You mean, letting Sakura go alone with you? Gaara frowned. You're correct. I don't like it. There won't be anyone in the compound to hurt her, if I've read the situation right. Just me and her, in and out, back before anyone realizes what's up. And this is necessary? No other way. Not that I can think of. All right. Gaara nodded. Then we will do it. Sakura couldn't help but swallow again, nervous. Infiltrating the Uchiha compound, what would Sasuke think of her if he ever found out? And the other villages, if she was discovered. But Shikamaru was the smartest person she knew. If he thought there was something in the compound to discover, she had to trust him. We do it. Sakura agreed. Whenever you're ready, Shikamaru. Tomorrow then. The quicker we do it, the more time we have to analyze what we find. After all, we don't have much time before the next step of our plan. The next step? Right. The Churyunin exams are coming up, and both our teams will be participating. That'll be limiting the ability we have to research, but it will also mark the next phase of the plan. Because, if I'm correct, Danzo will be making his move at that time as well. Shikamaru looked to Sakura, as serious as ever. Danzo, either he or someone under his influence going to ask you to do something in the coming weeks. Something that's going to seem ridiculous. Maybe even stupid. You should protest it, claim you don't want to do it, but whatever happens, you have to do it. That's really ominous, Shikamaru. Sakura frowned. Why would I want to do something that Danzo wants me to do? And what do you think he's going to ask, anyway? Shikamaru put a finger to his lips. It'll be more genuine if I don't tell you, but you'll know when the time comes. And at that time, you'll know what the next step of the plan is. Trust me. So much she didn't know, so much she wanted to know. But she was the one who had brought Shikamaru into this. She couldn't pull back now. I trust you. She confirmed. And only time would tell if her judgment was correct. It was almost pitch black as she made her way back home, Gaara and Sai close behind her. They were silent as they returned, each of them still mulling over what had been discussed in the Nara compound. Even as they each settled in for the night, Sakura found herself too anxious to fall asleep just yet. She made her way to the roof of her house, spreading out against the tiles and looking up at the stars. She couldn't wrestle the feeling of dread from her heart, and likely wouldn't until Danzo was dealt with. And who knew when that would be? Sometime after the Churyunin exams, but what could the exams possibly do to help them? Sakura thought back to her own exam a year ago. So much had happened then, so much had changed. Sasuke had met Orochimaru, Naruto had met Jiraiya and started harnessing the power of the fox, and she had realized, for the first time, what she would have to do to become a true shinobi. Were these exams destined to be another beacon of change? Would everything she knew get turned on its head, once again? Sakura took a deep breath, closing her eyes. Only time would tell, she supposed. She put her hands around the amulet at her neck, letting herself lull into a meditative state. Out of instinct, she let her sensing jutsu pulse out around her. She sensed Gaara and Sai below, sensed the vague energies of the shinobi stationed around the village, and something, nearby. Sakura opened her eyes, squinting in the darkness. On a rooftop, one house over, Sakura saw her. A woman, dressed in a long black coat. Even in the darkness, Sakura could see the brilliant blue of her hair. Then, as the wind blew and pushed against them, the woman's image seemed to flutter away and fade into the night. Sakura stood up, looking around and sending out her sensing pulse again. There was no sign of the signature, nothing like what she'd sensed before. Was she losing it? The woman's signal had been so faint that she'd barely picked up on it at all. So faint that, before her time with Itachi, Sakura might not have even been capable of sensing it. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she'd been seeing shadows. But something told her, something insisted. No. Her troubles at Konoha had only just begun. Check the description for the links to the author.